In the darkest corners of the galaxy, the Draxian Empire was known as a force of terror. For centuries, they had crushed entire worlds under their boot, leaving nothing but ashes in their wake. Their warriors were unbeatable, so strong, so fast, so brutal that no one dared challenge them. The Draxians ruled with fear, and that fear spread to every corner of the universe. No army, no race, no force could stand up to them, except for one. That one force was humanity. The humans had barely managed to survive against the Draxian Empire's many attempts to conquer Earth. Time after time, they had been underestimated. Time after time, humanity had found a way to fight back. They were small, but they were clever. They didn't have the power of the Draxians, but they had something else: determination. This time, however, was different. The Draxians had decided that they would end the humans once and for all. The high commanders of the Draxian fleet were tired of these persistent, pesky humans. They wanted to make an example of Earth, to show the galaxy that no one, not even humans, could stand against their might. But the Draxians didn't just send any soldier to Earth. They sent Korath. Korath was the deadliest warrior the Draxians had ever produced. His reputation had spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. He was known as the Warrior of 10,000 Worlds, a title earned through his unmatched skills in battle. Korath had fought and won in hundreds of battles. His opponents ranged from the toughest alien creatures to the most skilled assassins in the universe. No one had ever survived facing him one-on-one. He was invincible. The humans had heard of Korath. They had heard stories of his violence and cruelty. They knew that sending him to Earth meant death for every man, woman, and child on the planet. But what they didn't know was this: Korath was about to face something he never anticipated. As the Draxian warship approached Earth, its massive engines leaving a trail of destruction in its wake, the humans gathered. Their world had been under threat for so long, and now, with the arrival of Korath, they knew this was the final test. Would they fold in fear, or would they fight back? The highest military leaders of Earth held a tense meeting in their underground command center. The situation was dire. They knew that the only chance they had was to face Korath head-on. But who could take on the most dangerous warrior in the galaxy? A young officer, a soldier no one had heard of, stood up. His name was Mark Donovan, and his eyes were full of determination. He wasn't one of the higher-ups, but he had earned the respect of his peers through years of service. He was quick on his feet, clever, and above all, he had a fierce will to protect his people. "I'll do it," Mark said, his voice steady. "I'll face him." There was silence in the room. No one thought it was possible. Korath had taken down entire armies with his bare hands. But Mark didn't hesitate. He knew what was at stake. The generals were skeptical. "You understand the risk, soldier?" one asked. "I understand," Mark replied. "But I won't let Earth fall. We can't give up." The commanders exchanged uncertain glances, but finally they agreed. There was no one else. If humanity had any hope of surviving this threat, Mark would have to be the one to face the Draxian warrior. The soldiers prepared for the inevitable. The entire planet seemed to hold its breath as Korath's ship descended toward Earth, crashing into a barren wasteland in the middle of the planet. The ground shook, and the air was filled with a deafening roar. Korath stepped out of the ship, towering over the landscape. His armored form was like a moving fortress, his weapons gleaming in the light. His eyes, cold and unfeeling, scanned the horizon, and he let out a deep laugh. This was it, the final battle. As he advanced, the military gathered their forces, watching from a distance. It was as if the entire world had come to a standstill. Every person was afraid. No one had ever stood a chance against Korath. What hope did a single human soldier have? Mark Donovan stood alone on the battlefield, a small figure compared to the towering Draxian warrior. His heart raced, but his mind was calm. He had trained for this. He wasn't a super soldier. He didn't have any extraordinary powers, but he had something Korath didn't understand: human resourcefulness. Mark wasn't going to face Korath head-on in the traditional way. No, that would be suicide. He had a plan, one that relied on his quick thinking and the environment around him. Korath's power was overwhelming, but his arrogance would be his downfall. The two warriors locked eyes from across the battlefield. The Draxian smirked, confident that the end was near. Mark's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. The time for fear was over. This was the moment when everything would change. The battle for Earth had begun, and Mark Donovan had no intention of letting the galaxy's deadliest warrior win. The sun hung low in the sky, casting an eerie red glow across the wasteland. Mark stood his ground, feeling the weight of his mission settle in his chest. Korath, the galaxy's most feared warrior, was approaching, his heavy steps causing the ground beneath Mark to tremble. The air was thick with tension as the Draxian assassin marched toward him, each footfall a reminder of the devastation he had caused across countless worlds. Mark didn't flinch. He had trained for this moment his entire life. He didn't have the strength Korath possessed, nor did he have the invincibility of the Draxian. But what he did have was the ability to think, to outsmart his opponents, and he knew Korath's arrogance would be his weakness. "You really think you stand a chance?" Korath's voice was a low growl, vibrating with power. He towered over Mark, his massive form a terrifying sight. His armor gleamed in the dim light, and his weapons, long, jagged blades, were held ready, dripping with the blood of countless victims. Mark stood tall, locking eyes with the warrior. "I don't think. I know." Korath let out a derisive laugh, clearly amused. "You humans, always so bold, so foolish. Your death will be quick, and the galaxy will finally know that your kind can be erased. You should have stayed hidden." Mark's grip tightened on the small, seemingly insignificant device in his hand. The small, compact gun was nothing like Korath's massive weaponry. It was a human weapon, built for quick strikes and surprise. But Mark wasn't planning to fight with brute force. He was going to outwit this monster, and he had the perfect plan in mind. Without warning, Korath lunged forward, his massive sword swinging with such speed that Mark barely had time to react. The air around him screamed as the blade cut through the space he'd been standing in just a moment before. Mark ducked and rolled to the side, narrowly avoiding the attack, his heart pounding in his chest. Korath smirked, enjoying the hunt. "You're fast, I'll give you that," he said, voice tripping with contempt. "But speed won't save you." Mark scrambled to his feet, his eyes scanning the battlefield for any advantage. He couldn't match Korath's raw power. He couldn't even hope to block the warrior's strikes. But there was one thing Mark knew. Humans were resourceful. They didn't need to be stronger to win. They only needed to be smarter. Korath swung again, and Mark ducked once more, this time rolling under the warrior's blade and moving swiftly toward a small ridge of rocks that jutted out from the ground. He dove behind the rocks just as the deadly blade struck the earth, sending shards of rock flying in every direction. "You can't hide, human. I'll find you." Korath roared, his voice filled with rage. The ground trembled as the Draxian warrior stormed toward Mark's position, his footsteps shaking the very earth beneath them. But Mark wasn't hiding. He was thinking. He knew that Korath's size and strength made him slow, and his arrogance made him predictable. Every time Korath swung his sword, Mark had barely avoided it, and he had learned something with each near miss. The warrior's attacks were powerful but lacked precision. Korath's confidence in his own strength blinded him to the possibility that someone might outmaneuver him. Mark's hand moved to his side, reaching for a small grenade he had attached to his belt. It was a simple explosive device, but it had one purpose: to give him a chance. He didn't need to defeat Korath in a direct fight. He just needed to create the opening he needed. With a sudden motion, Mark hurled the grenade over the rocks, straight into the path where Korath was charging. The explosion erupted, throwing a cloud of smoke and debris into the air. Korath was momentarily blinded by the dust and the loud blast. His roar of frustration echoed through the wasteland as he stumbled backward, trying to regain his vision. Mark didn't hesitate. He rushed forward, using the smoke as cover. His heart was pounding in his chest, but his mind was clear. He could hear Koreth's heavy breathing, his growls of anger. Mark knew he only had a few seconds before the Draxian regained his senses. As the smoke began to clear, Mark found himself face to face with Koreth. The Draxian's eyes burned with fury, but there was something else in them, something that hadn't been there before. Fear. The first crack in Koreth's invincible armor. Mark used that moment of hesitation to his advantage. He darted to the side, ducking low and using his agility to hit behind Koreth. Before the Draxian could react, Mark launched himself at the warrior's back, landing a blow with his weapon that sent sparks flying off Koreth's armor. Koreth let out an enraged scream, spinning around to face Mark. But Mark was already moving again, constantly staying one step ahead. Every time Koreth swung, Mark was gone, always just out of reach. The Draxian's rage grew with every failed strike, and Mark kept his distance, knowing that every second counted. "You can't keep running," Koreth shouted, slamming his sword into the ground, sending a shockwave of energy through the air. Mark didn't run. He kept moving, kept calculating. He knew he was wearing Koreth down. The Draxian was losing his focus, his arrogance crumbling. The human had proven something that no one had ever expected, that even the deadliest warrior in the galaxy could be outsmarted. And with that thought, Mark's plan was coming together. The real fight had only just begun. The wasteland was quiet for a brief moment, the air thick with the scent of burning ozone and crushed earth. Koreth's heavy breathing was the only sound that echoed across the battlefield as he glared at Mark, his rage evident in the fiery red glow of his eyes. The Draxian's once proud stance had faltered, his massive shoulders heaving as he tried to regain control of the situation. Mark didn't take his eyes off the warrior. He knew this was the critical moment, the one chance he had to break Koreth's confidence, to prove that the galaxy's most feared warrior could be defeated by a mere human. Koreth's hand clenched around his weapon, and his voice, now dripping with venom, filled the air. "You think you can outsmart me? You think you can win?" His voice was deep and guttural, but it trembled slightly, betraying his unease. Mark said nothing. He knew Koreth had underestimated him from the beginning. The massive warrior had seen humans as weak, insignificant creatures, nothing more than a brief annoyance. He had believed that the moment he set foot on Earth, Mark's fate was sealed. But that arrogance had blinded him. And now Mark had the upper hand. The human's heart raced, but his mind remained calm, focused. He had no intention of killing Koreth. That was never the point. The goal was always to prove that humans were capable of more than anyone, even the most powerful warriors in the galaxy, could comprehend. Mark tightened his grip on his weapon, the small, compact human-made gun, and moved once again. This time, he was ready for whatever Koreth would throw at him. With a low growl, Koreth charged forward, his massive sword raised high in the air. Mark could see the power behind the swing, the sheer force that would tear through anything in its path. But Mark had been anticipating this. He could already hear Koreth's movements in his mind, predicting where the blade would strike. At the last second, Mark rolled to the left, narrowly avoiding the swing. The sword cleaved through the air where he had been just moments before. Mark was already on his feet, running at full speed, using the momentum of Koreth's missed blow to propel him forward. Before Koreth could recover, Mark leaped into the air, landing on a rock formation behind him. From there, he had the perfect vantage point. The warrior was still reeling from his failed strike, and Mark saw it, the crack in Koreth's once impenetrable armor. The Draxian was no longer the untouchable warrior he had been just minutes ago. He was vulnerable. Mark aimed his weapon at Koreth's exposed side and fired. The shot rang out with a sharp, crisp sound, hitting Koreth's armor with a burst of energy. The force of the blast sent the Draxian stumbling back, a deep groan escaping from his throat as the impact sent him crashing into the ground. The shockwave from the blast rattled the surroundings, dust and debris swirling into the air. For the first time since their encounter began, Korath fell to his knees. His massive form, once so towering and intimidating, now appeared almost vulnerable. Mark didn't give him a chance to recover. He quickly moved forward, his footsteps light and purposeful. He was a blur of motion, evading the retaliatory swings Korath tried to land. Mark knew that his chance wouldn't last long. Korath's strength was formidable, and the Draxian warrior's rage would soon return. But for now, Mark had the advantage. Korath roared, shaking his head as he struggled to regain his composure. He looked up at Mark, disbelief written across his face. How? Korath's voice trembled, a rare crack in his pride. How is this possible? How can a human? Mark stepped forward, the weapon in his hand still trained on the warrior. Humans never give up. We never quit, no matter how impossible the odds seem. You underestimated us, Korath, and that was your mistake. Korath snarled, pulling himself up with a force that made the earth beneath him shake. He was angry, perhaps more than he had ever been in his life. His pride was shattered, his confidence broken by a single human. You're nothing but an insect, Korath growled, his voice now filled with fury. I'll crush you like I've crushed every other pitiful creature that dared to face me. But Mark wasn't afraid. He had heard that same threat countless times before, from countless opponents, and each time, the result was the same. The human always survived. Against all odds, humans always found a way. And this time would be no different. Mark's eyes narrowed. He knew Korath's anger would cloud his judgment, and that would be his downfall. Korath was too proud, too blinded by his need for revenge. He would make mistakes, and Mark would capitalize on them. As Korath charged once again, Mark prepared himself for the next move. He knew that his survival was no longer about the weapons they wielded or the strength they had. It was about perseverance, intelligence, and determination. And in those areas, humanity was unmatched. The battle wasn't over yet, but it was clear that Mark had already won. And as Korath made his next move, Mark was ready to finish what he had started. The dust from Korath's last strike still hung thick in the air, and the ground trembled from his heavy footsteps. But Mark was already moving, not giving the warrior a moment to recover. The human's focus remained sharp, his heart pounding in his chest, but his mind was as calm as a still lake. He knew this was the moment. Korath, now visibly furious, raised his weapon once more, his hand trembling from the force of his rage. His once immense confidence had begun to crack, and Mark could see it in his eyes. The Draxian warrior was starting to question his own power. His arrogance had always been his greatest weapon, but now it was his greatest weakness. Enough. Korath roared, his voice so deep it reverberated in Mark's chest. He charged forward, his sword raised high above his head, the air sizzling as it cut through the atmosphere. The massive blade glinted in the light, a streak of silver that promised instant death to anyone caught in its path. But Mark didn't flinch. He didn't hesitate. He had trained for moments like this. He had learned that the key to surviving against overwhelming power wasn't just strength, but the ability to outthink your opponent. As Korath swung his sword down with brutal force, Mark dropped low to the ground, sliding effortlessly under the weapon's arc. He could feel the rush of wind as the blade narrowly missed his head, just inches from severing him in two. Mark's heart raced, but his focus never wavered. The key was to move faster, anticipate Korath's moves, and then strike. Korath's attack had left him exposed, his immense strength leaving him momentarily off balance. Mark saw his chance. In a flash, he surged forward, his feet propelling him across the cracked earth like a coiled spring. With one swift, calculated motion, Mark launched himself onto Korath's back, grabbing hold of the Draxian warrior's massive shoulders. The sudden weight on Korath caused him to stumble, and for a brief moment, Mark had control. The warrior snarled in pain as Mark's arms locked around his neck, using every ounce of strength he could muster to hold on. Korath's hands reached up to claw at him, but Mark was too quick, dodging the warrior's attempts to shake him off. Mark knew he couldn't afford to make a mistake now. Korath, though struggling, was still a deadly force. His anger and pride were fueling him, making him fight harder than ever before. But Mark had something Korath didn't: human ingenuity. With his free hand, Mark pulled something from his belt, a small device, barely larger than a matchbox. It was a specialized EMP grenade, designed to disable energy shields and disrupt the electrical systems of alien technology. The perfect tool for this kind of battle. He had hoped never to use it, but now was the time. In one fluid motion, Mark activated the grenade and attached it to Korath's armor. The EMP burst to life, a brief pulse of energy that sent a wave of static through the air. Korath's body jerked, and for the first time in their entire confrontation, the mighty Draxian warrior stumbled. His sword slipped from his hand as his armor shorted out, unable to protect him from the shockwave. Mark took advantage of the opening, throwing himself away from Korath's stunned form. The warrior collapsed to his knees, his armor sparking and hissing as it tried, and failed to reboot. For a moment, everything was still. The battlefield, once alive with the sounds of battle, was eerily silent as both combatants caught their breath. But Mark knew the fight wasn't over yet. Korath would recover. He always did. And this time, Mark would have to finish it. The Draxian slowly rose to his feet, his eyes burning with rage and disbelief. He glared at Mark, clearly shocked at how close he had come to losing. You filthy human," Korath hissed, his voice strained from the pain of the EMP's effects. "You will regret this." Mark's eyes narrowed. He wasn't interested in Korath's threats anymore. The warrior had underestimated humanity from the start, thinking that his strength and reputation would be enough to defeat any opponent. But Mark had shown him something different. Humans weren't just survivors, they were innovators. They found a way, no matter the odds. Mark's voice was steady, unyielding. "You've underestimated us from the beginning, Korath. And now you'll learn the hard way that humans don't stop fighting until the job is done." Korath's anger only intensified. His mind, clouded by the defeat he could barely comprehend, roared for revenge. But Mark was ready. He had already proven that Korath wasn't invincible. He had already proven that the galaxy's deadliest warrior could fall. With one final determined move, Mark prepared for what would be the last strike. Mark stood tall, his body still aching from the intense battle. The EMP device had taken its toll on Korath, but it wasn't enough to defeat him. Not yet. Korath, with his dark eyes burning with fury, lifted his head to glare at the human. His hand clutched the hilt of his sword again, this time with greater determination. The moment had come, the final showdown. Mark's mind raced as he took a deep breath. His heart pounded with adrenaline, but there was a calmness in his thoughts. He had studied Korath's fighting style, watched his movements, and now he knew exactly what to do. Every second counted. The warrior was strong, but Mark had a plan, and it would only take one perfect strike. Korath, fueled by rage, charged again, his massive frame moving with deadly speed. The roar of his footsteps echoed across the battlefield, the ground beneath him shaking as if it could not withstand the power of his attack. He swung his sword in an arc, aiming to cut Mark down in one fatal motion. Mark ducked just in time, his body narrowly avoiding the massive blade. The air whistled as the sword passed overhead, but Mark's focus was unshaken. As soon as he was clear of Korath's strike, he rolled to the side, swiftly getting to his feet in a fluid motion. The Draxian warrior had left himself vulnerable after the attack, and Mark wasted no time. He charged toward Korath, dodging another wild swing from the mighty warrior. In that split second, Mark saw an opening, the joint in the armor near Korath's ribs. That was the weak spot he had been searching for. With precision and speed, Mark closed the distance. He could hear Korath's ragged breathing, his exhaustion beginning to show. Mark reached into his pouch and pulled out a small blade, a weapon that had been carefully designed for close combat. It wasn't much, but it didn't need to be. The key was in the strike. Mark dove under Korath's raised arm, slipping past the warrior's defenses and sinking the blade into the vulnerable spot in Korath's armor. It slid in with surprising ease, and Mark twisted it, targeting the most vital areas. Korath's roar echoed across the battlefield as he staggered backward, his immense body shuddering from the blow. He reached down to where the blade had pierced his armor, trying to pull it out, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The warrior's breathing became shallow, and his strength began to drain away. Mark stood up, his heart still racing as he watched Korath fall to his knees. The once mighty Draxian, the galaxy's deadliest warrior, now crumpled before him, defeated and helpless. "I told you," Mark said, his voice steady and unwavering. "You underestimated humans." Korath's eyes glowed with a mix of disbelief and rage, but it was clear that the fight had left him. The battle was over, and the impossible had just been achieved. Mark had faced the galaxy's most feared assassin and emerged victorious. The silence that followed was deafening. The echo of Korath's defeat rang in the air, a resounding message that sent shockwaves across the battlefield. Mark stood victorious, but the cost of the battle had been high. He could feel the weariness in his limbs, the soreness that came from pushing beyond human limits, but it didn't matter. He had won. Mark stepped back from Korath's fallen form, his eyes scanning the horizon. The rest of the Draxian forces were retreating, their greatest warrior lying in a heap before a mere human. It was a moment that would be remembered across the galaxy for years to come. The universe had learned a valuable lesson today. No one could ever truly defeat humanity. No matter the odds, no matter the challenge, humans would always rise up. And in that moment, Mark knew this victory wasn't just his. It was a victory for every human who had ever fought for survival, for every person who had ever faced impossible odds. And it wasn't over yet. The galaxy would never be the same after today. The dust settled on the battlefield, and the once thriving encampment of the Draxian forces was now eerily silent. The hum of energy weapons, the thunder of boots marching in sync, and the shouts of alien commanders had all been replaced by an overwhelming stillness. The only sound now was the labored breathing of Mark as he stood tall, his eyes fixed on the now defeated Korath. Mark's mind was a blur of thoughts, but one thing was clear. The battle wasn't just about defeating Korath. It was about something much larger. Humanity had just sent a message to the entire galaxy, a message that would ripple through the stars, shaking the very foundation of every alien civilization. But Mark couldn't afford to bask in his victory for long. He was no hero in his eyes, just a soldier who had done his duty. There was still much more at stake. The galaxy's mightiest warriors had been thrown into chaos by a single human, and the message was clear. Earth wasn't going to submit. The Draxian fleet, once so confident and oppressive, now hesitated. They had witnessed firsthand the depths of human resilience. Their greatest assassin had fallen, and in doing so, Mark had inadvertently shattered the aura of invincibility the Draxians had built over centuries. As Mark took a cautious step forward, his gaze never leaving Korath's fallen body, he heard movement behind him. He turned, instinctively reaching for the weapon at his side. His muscles tensed, but his hand relaxed when he saw who it was. General Aria Volth, the leader of Earth's resistance forces, approached him with a measured stride. Her uniform was dirtied from the battle, but her eyes were filled with admiration and respect. "You did it," Aria said quietly, her voice tinged with awe. "The impossible. You made it possible." Mark gave a small nod, wiping the blood from his brow. "We did it," he replied, his voice rough but resolute. "We just showed them what happens when they underestimate us." Aria paused beside him, her gaze lingering on Korath's lifeless form. The alien warrior, who had once been a living nightmare, was now nothing more than a fallen giant. "The fleet will be in disarray," Arya continued, her eyes scanning the retreating Draxian forces. "Without Korath, they'll lose their coordination. This is our moment. We need to push forward now, before they regroup." Mark nodded in agreement. The fight was far from over, but this victory had done something no one expected. It had fractured the confidence of an empire that had long considered itself untouchable. But there was still much to do. The battle against the Draxian Empire was only beginning, and there was no telling what other obstacles awaited them in the stars. "Let's not waste this opportunity," Mark said, his voice steady despite the exhaustion weighing on his body. "We move now, while they're confused. Earth won't fall today." The two of them turned their attention back to the battlefield, where the remaining Draxian forces were retreating, still reeling from the loss of their greatest warrior. The galaxy would never forget this moment, the moment when a human took on the deadliest assassin and won. But as Mark looked over the horizon, a question gnawed at him. What would happen now? What would be the cost of this victory? The Draxians would not simply roll over, and there would be retaliation. Humanity had just stepped onto a much bigger stage, and the consequences of this victory would echo throughout the galaxy. Mark felt the weight of that truth sink in. But it didn't matter. Humans had never backed down, and they weren't about to start now. This was their fight, their survival, and no one, not even the most fearsome assassins in the galaxy, could stop them. As the first rays of dawn broke over the battlefield, Mark and Arya looked at each other, silent but united in their resolve. This was only the beginning, and together they would ensure that humanity's voice was heard in the galaxy, loud and clear. For now, the galaxy had learned a lesson it would never forget. Never underestimate the human spirit. The real war had just begun. The battle was over. Korath, the galaxy's deadliest assassin, lay in a heap of twisted metal and organic matter, his imposing presence now a mere memory. The Draxian forces, once so proud and sure of their power, were retreating. Their greatest weapon had fallen, and with it, their confidence shattered. But even in the silence that followed, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something larger was at play. He stood in the midst of the battlefield, his eyes scanning the horizon where the last of the Draxian ships were vanishing into the depths of space. The sound of retreating engines was like a distant echo in his mind. But this victory, monumental as it was, didn't offer the comfort of peace. It only bred questions. The galaxy was vast, and if one deadly assassin had been capable of such destruction, what would the entire Draxian Empire be willing to do in retaliation? Arya stepped up beside him, her gaze fixed on the horizon. "We won today," she said softly. "But the war, it's not over." Mark looked at her, a flicker of grim realization in his eyes. He had done what no one thought possible, but they both knew the truth. The Draxian Empire was not one to forget a defeat so easily, and if Korath's death was any indication, there would be more assassins, more warriors, more threats in the shadows, waiting to strike. The tactical commander on the ground, Colonel Vance, approached them, his steps measured but confident. He had led Earth's forces on the ground, and now his eyes gleamed with a fierce determination. "Mark, we've got a moment," Vance said, his voice low. "The fleet's been contacted. The Draxian Empire's flagship. It's coming. We have less than an hour." Mark exhaled slowly, the weight of the information pressing down on him. "So, they're not running away for good." "No," Vance replied. "They're just regrouping, and they're not taking kindly to losing their most lethal assassin." Mark turned to Arya. "How long do we have?" "Not long enough," she answered, her voice resolute but tinged with concern. "They'll want revenge, and they'll bring everything they have." The wind whistled through the wreckage of the battlefield, carrying with it a deep, eerie silence. Mark felt the pressure of the universe's gaze on them. Their victory had been hard-won, but it was only a momentary reprieve. The galaxy had just realized something about humanity. something that made them fear and respect Earth more than they ever had before. And yet Mark understood that fear would not stop the Draxians. The galaxy's darkest forces would not take defeat lightly. Earth was about to become a target, but they would not go down without a fight. "We'll need to hit them first," Mark said, his voice hardening with determination. "We've shown the galaxy we can bleed, but we've also shown them we can fight back. We'll strike before they have a chance to regroup." Arya nodded. "The fleet's on standby, and the forces on the ground are ready. But we need to act quickly. The Draxians will be bringing more than just reinforcements. They'll be bringing everything they have, and they won't stop until Earth's wiped out." Mark stood still for a moment, deep in thought. The next steps were crucial. They couldn't afford to give the Draxians the time they needed to regroup. The war had shifted, and now humanity had to make sure it didn't slip back into the shadows of the galaxy. "Gather everyone," Mark finally said. "This war is far from over, and the real fight begins now. Let's show them what humanity can do when we're pushed to the edge." His words were more than just a command. They were a declaration. The galaxy had learned that humanity could survive, even thrive, against the greatest assassins and forces in existence. But now, Mark realized, it was time to prove that Earth would fight to the very last breath. As Mark turned to face the rest of the battlefield, he felt a surge of adrenaline. His body was battered, his energy waning, but his mind was sharper than ever. The Draxian Empire would soon learn what it meant to face an enemy who would not surrender. The fight had only begun, and Earth would not back down. The galaxy had underestimated humanity, but now the real battle would show them the price of that mistake. And somewhere, out there in the deep expanse of space, the Draxians would learn the hard way: never underestimate the will of a human being.